Hello everyone, I'm Kai Sampson, Tax Commissioner for the state of Vermont. I'm here with Deb Carroll and we're up from Montpelier to talk about taxes and the upcoming tax season. Deb, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Deborah Carroll. I am the Principal Assistant with the Vermont Department of Taxes. And yes, we are here to talk about the upcoming tax season. So Kai, what is it that people need to know with respect to the upcoming tax season?
I think the first thing people need to sort out, and obviously many taxpayers have their history of how they've filed in the past, but is to think about, do I want to self-prepare my taxes? Do I want to use a paid preparer? Or do I qualify for some volunteer preparing assistance, which we can talk about a little bit later. And then there's obviously the popular software packages that people can purchase to prepare their taxes. As we'll talk about later, there are a lot of changes in the federal and state tax situation that came about due to federal change and state change. So it's a good year to really pay closer attention, I'd say, than in other years. And for many folks, that might mean consulting with a tax advisor for the first time if they're used to doing things on their own. But for many folks who are comfortable understanding the tax situation and have filed taxes by themselves or with the assistance of software in the past, if they feel comfortable, they can continue filing that way.
So I understand that a certain population is eligible for Free File, to file for free?
That's right. Free File is an alliance between the IRS and certain vendors, software vendors, that provides discounted or actually free access to software and e-filing if you meet certain criteria or eligibility thresholds. And those vary by vendor, but we have a slide here that shows you how you can learn more about free filing assistance. And again, that's going to be a software package that you can get free access to, the same type of software packages for preparation that many folks might buy off the shelf or download. If you meet certain income or other eligibility criteria, you can access and file for free through those vendors. So if you look at the slide that we've made available here, you can go to irs.gov and search for free tax help. But for the free file vendors that are approved and have packages for the state of Vermont, you want to go to tax.vermont.gov/free file, and you'll see a list of vendor packages that are part of the Free File Alliance that are also able to complete or help you self-prepare and then file your state of Vermont taxes. So if you go to the IRS site, you'll see a list of vendors that are in the Free File Alliance and what their eligibility criteria are for the federal taxes, but it's, you might want to take a look at the Vermont Tax Department website that we've listed here so that you can make sure that that software will also work for filing your state of Vermont taxes, so you can kind of do that in one step. It's important to remember that this is not one-on-one taxpayer assistance by any means. This is for people that feel comfortable preparing their own taxes using this software. If you don't feel comfortable with that, but you do feel you need help and maybe you can't afford help, there are several options available that we've also referred to on this slide where you can get some one-on-one tax assistance through AARP or through VITA, which is a national program, and we've provided those resources and how to access them on this site as well. And then back to my earlier comments, the third area to really think about is you know, whether your tax situation or your understanding of your tax situation is complex enough or confusing enough that you want to see some of this or seek out some of this free assistance, or even start thinking about looking at a paid tax preparer. So we always encourage people to kind of recognize when things are too complex for them to navigate on their own, and don't be afraid to get some of the free help or even the paid help that's available to folks out there.
So who is eligible for Free File?
Well, those web resources that we've pointed you to will tell you usually There's a lot of programs for military personnel, and then there's a lot of income eligibility, and again, it does vary, but generally it's in the $50,000 to $60,000 range of income, and if you're at that or below that, typically you'll be able to find some of the assistance is available to you, either some of the free file software or also some of the one-on-one taxpayer assistance that I referenced.
So tell us about e-filing. What are the benefits of e-filing?
Yeah, so we're constantly working with taxpayers to encourage them to e-file, and we've had great success. About 85% of taxpayers e-file their personal income tax return with the state of Vermont. And the benefits of that are accuracy. You know, if there's a field missing or whatever, usually the software package you're using will let you know. There are built-in cross-checks within the package so that it really cuts down on a lot of errors that we do see in paper-filed returns. But it's also speed. A lot of people this time of year are looking to get a refund and they want to get it back as soon as possible, which of course we can understand. If you e-file, your average refund time for the Vermont refund will be 28 days, or was 28 days last year. We'll try to improve on that this year. And 75% of e-filers last year got their refund within 30 days. So 3/4 of Vermonters got their refund within 30 days if they e-filed. Now, the alternative to e-filing is paper filing. And I think if you looked in our mailroom at the Vermont Department of Taxes during busy season, that would probably be one more thing encouraging you to consider e-filing. We really have these large mail bins, crates full of mail that we have to kind of sort through, organize, and then we have to scan all of those after we open them and organize them and scan all of them and then digitize that information, because all of the review and cross-checks that we do, quality review and fraud control review, happens with our tax computer system. So when people paper file, they have to kind of budget in that just for us to process the paper and do quality review over it and scan it could add 2 to 4 weeks in many cases to the processing time before we put it into digital format. One of the things that we're really trying hard to improve, but our scanners will pick up a lot of the numbers that are on a paper file incorrectly. Look at a comma and think it's a 1, etc. Particularly if it's a handwritten file. We have a little better success with printed paper filings where it's printed from a software package. But all of those errors result in a greater chance of problems and delay in people's refunds. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but among paper filers, the average refund time is 40 days, so about 2 weeks longer than e-filers. And whereas 75% of Vermonters last year who e-filed got their refund in 30 days or less, for paper filers it's 58%. So significant lower amount of folks were able to get their refund within 30 days, which is one benchmark that we measure when it comes to refund timeliness. So again, really strongly recommend e-filing. It's secure, it's safe. We have a lot of controls in place, as do the software vendors and the IRS who help process this modernized e-filing system.
So there are other things that can hold up tax returns, and I understand that one of those is filing too early. Can you tell us how that impacts what the potential pitfalls are with respect to filing early?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Folks that file, we do have a population of folks that are really excited to file. They're looking forward to getting their refund, finding out what it's going to be, and sometimes they jump the gun. And what we see most likely, or much more likely in early filings, is folks that didn't quite get everything. They think they have everything. They file early. They want to get that refund, but they're missing some interest income or a W-2 that they forgot, or a 1099, which is a form that comes to us that shows miscellaneous income. So if you are going to be filing early, please take extra time to make sure you've included everything. And if you're not sure that you have everything, take a look at last year's filing. It might jog your memory of some of the sources of income or even deductions that you took in the prior year, and then think through what you did for tax-based activity over the year and make sure you have everything. The reason we really emphasize that this time of year is because if you are kind of in a rush to file and get information to us and you forget to add something, the process is that at the tax department it's going to error in our system. It's going to go, there's going to be missing information because we're verifying all of this withholding or income information with other sources of information from the employer or from the bank or whomever it is. And if there's a mismatch, that return will get put into a work list for one of our examiners to review manually, and that work list starts to build very quickly. Once you're on that work list, it's kind of first come, first serve, and it can be a while before we get to it, sort out what the difference is. Then we enter a code into the system to send a letter saying it looks like we're missing this type of information. That has the paper mail process. That could take a couple days or more to get to you, and then by the time you're able to look at it, process it, respond. So all of a sudden, having an error, you thought you were filing very kind of abruptly or quickly to get your refund fast. Making one error like that can actually end up costing you a lot more in time than if you had taken some time to let the mail come in. We're recording this in late January. A lot of filings aren't due by the employers or banks until the last day in January. So at a minimum, I think give it some time for January to mature and even into February.
And while I'm sure that a lot of people are familiar with their W-2s look like, perhaps not everyone is familiar with what a 1099 looks like.
Right.
And we've got a slide so that people can see what those documents will look like when they get them in the mail from their employers.
That's right. I just brought that up, Deb. So this is a typical image of what a W-2 and a 1099 look like. The W-2 is filed by your employer for wage income. It shows how much taxable income you had during the year and how much you had withheld for Vermont taxes and for federal taxes. And again, Deb and I are from the Vermont tax department, so we won't get into federal taxes as much. But we share a lot of the same data, and we base our tax system off a lot of the same data. The 1099, there's a whole slew of different 1099 forms, but this one is for miscellaneous income. So if you did some contracting work or consulting work or other non-wage type labor that you got paid for, that payer will likely issue you a 1099, and it helps you keep track of what income to report. And again, these two areas are the most common form of mismatch in our system, is people not putting the correct information or the employer sometimes being late to file this information with us. So at the same time you're getting this data, the tax department is getting this data, hopefully, and so that we can put it into our system and match things up and make sure that when we're paying a refund, it's not a fraudulent attempt, of which we're seeing a lot of attempts with state tax departments and the IRS to basically fraudulently file for refunds and get at state money. Usually those come from out of state. We see a lot less of that as far as in-state, but we have to be, our guards need to be up, and because of that we do have to match a lot of data in the common era here and make sure that we're not sending refunds out to folks that haven't earned it with legitimate information.
So with changes, so let's move on to changes to Vermont's tax forms. With changes at the federal level and changes at the state level, I understand that there's a lot of changes to our forms. I know that the tax department has been working very hard in the last few weeks to create the final versions of these forms, and we've got a slide for that as well.
Yeah, so the forms changed a lot. I'll pull up that slide, and it'll take a while to get to that. But this year, or 2018, was a huge change in both federal and state income tax. At the federal level, in December of 2017, the president signed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which radically changed for the first time in 35 plus years. I believe is when the last time we had this type of change, how federal taxes are computed. Because the state of Vermont is on a it was linked to federal information as much as possible to keep things as simple for tax filers. When things changed a lot at the federal level, it kind of forced the state to think about making changes to adapt to that. Had we changed nothing last year, taxes in Vermont, personal income taxes in Vermont would have gone up by about $30 million, and neither the legislature or the governor was interested in allowing that $30 million accidental tax hike happen in the 2018 tax year. So there were big reforms at the state level too, and the biggest change I think most taxpayers will notice, which we've pulled up by showing the slide here, is that Vermont now has its own standard deduction and its own personal exemption in law. In the past, we used to just kind of piggyback off of the federal system because we would kind of start with taxable income, federal taxable income, on the federal 1040, which incorporated these standard or itemized deductions and personal exemptions. Well, the federal reform got rid of the personal exemption. It took it from over $4,000 per person down to zero, and then doubled the standard deduction, doubled the child tax credit. So all these changes really disrupted how Vermont taxes were, how the tax calculation worked. So we had to kind of start from scratch and kind of rebuild our tax system in Vermont. And we successfully did that, working with the legislature. And that's in effect for all of 2018, which is the taxes that people are going to be filing this spring. And of course, it does cause us to have a new tax form and tax calculation and some new concepts in there. But overall, I think it's a more simplified system. You're going to start with your adjusted gross income, and then you're going to take, as you can see in the sidebar of this graphic we have here of the new form, and then you're going to take a standard deduction, a Vermont standard deduction, and personal exemptions as appropriate for your family size, and then you work your way down to Vermont taxable income.
And the next slide actually has an overview of what the first page of the form looks like.
Yep.
This one significant change that people are going to notice is that the charitable contribution tax credit is now on there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we decided to do in Vermont reform was, because of the impact of the federal reform, for those of you that are familiar with the choice between taking the standard deduction and itemizing deductions, for those of you who were keeping track of mortgage interest paid, property taxes, charitable contributions, medical expenses, you were most likely itemizing deductions. That used to be about 30% of Vermonters. After this federal reform, it's now less than 10% of Vermonters. So what we did in Vermont, rather than continue to carry through those itemized deductions, which had already been made more complicated in the Vermont calculation through limitations and add-backs, we just said we're going to get rid of itemized deductions in Vermont. Everyone's going to have available the standard deduction, and then we're going to lower tax rates across the board. So taxable income goes up a little bit in Vermont, but you have lower rates taxing them so that we land system-wide at generally the same place. Now, each individual taxpayer with any type of reform is going to be affected differently, and so that's one reason we really encourage people to pay extra attention this year when they're filing and compare it to their federal to this year and last year and their state to this year and last year, and get a good understanding of what changed for them. But one of the things we brought forward, which we didn't have in the past, was a charitable contribution tax credit. And in the past, only folks who were itemizing at the federal level would get any type of tax advantage or deduction for donating to a charity or school or church. And what we did here was make that available to anyone. So anyone who has a tax liability in the state of Vermont who gives to a charity, a qualified nonprofit, school, or religious organization can take 5% of that donation and get a dollar-for-dollar reduction in their Vermont tax liability. That's capped at $20,000 of contributions. But again, this is going to be the first time for about 70% of Vermonters that they can think about getting some type of tax advantage for for charitable giving. And again, that includes, we see a lot of folks are giving to local food shelves, humane societies, churches, schools, those type of things. And so this is something people should be aware of. You could get a couple dollars or even a couple $100 off of your state taxes if you keep those receipts and keep track of your charitable contributions. Again, it doesn't matter if you itemize deductions at the federal level. This is available to anyone with a tax liability. So we are one of a few states that have this as a broad-based tax credit, and I think it's a great accomplishment.
And this is available for both monetary donations as well as tangible objects?
Right, so non-cash contributions are also eligible. Basically, we piggyback the eligibility off of the federal rules. So if you look at our instructions and guidance on this, it'll point you to the federal criteria for the IRS for what qualifies as a deduction at the IRS. So non-cash contributions have some different documentation standards, which would be a whole other 30-minute show that we probably shouldn't get into today. But if you read that guidance, and if you have significant contributions and you're confused or overwhelmed by what qualifies or what doesn't, try to review that guidance. If not, again, as I mentioned, sometimes seeking tax advice from a professional, whether some of the volunteer options we talked about or a paid professional is your best bet. But non-cash contributions could count as well, and you could again be qualifying for a 5% credit.
Yeah, and people need to keep the receipts. I think you had
Yep.
mentioned that as well. Another pretty significant change is in Social Security benefits this year.
Yeah, that's a big one, and will affect a lot of people. So prior to this 2018 tax year, which people are filing for now, Vermont was one of a few states that had no additional benefit for or tax exemption for Social Security benefits. The way it worked before this change that I'll talk about in a minute was the federal government on the IRS tax calculation will tax from 0 to 85% of your Social Security benefits, and that kind of comes through on the federal 1040. Whatever was taxable at the federal level used to come through to Vermont, and all of that would be taxable in Vermont as well. What we did was add an extra level of, and that's income based. That's based on your income, your total income, and kind of a complicated calculation at the federal level. In Vermont, we just say whatever came over for taxable on your federal tax form. We used to say that's taxable in Vermont. What we've done now is add a second level of exemption, where we'll say, okay, if you're married filing jointly and your adjusted gross income is under $70,000, you're going to get a partial or complete exemption of that Social Security income. So if you're less than $60,000 of married filing jointly, none of that Social Security income will come through as taxable income in Vermont. And for those that are not married filing jointly but filing single, that range is between $45,000 and $55,000, where you'd get a partial exemption. But if you're less than $45,000 of adjusted gross income, none of your Social Security benefits will be taxable in Vermont anymore. So those income ranges do affect about half of Vermont's Social Security recipients who were paying tax at some level prior to 2018. So it's a pretty significant change, favorable for our seniors in Vermont and our Social Security recipients. And in fact, it's all forms of Social Security income. So that will help out a lot of folks, and you don't want to miss that one.
Yeah, and I understand that we've got a form that we can show people with the instructions.
Yep. So this is the result of a calculation, I believe, that comes out of a worksheet, which we have right here. It probably, explaining it verbally, it sounds a little more complicated than it actually is, but essentially you start with your adjusted gross income, if you're married filing jointly and you're less than $60,000, this worksheet will say you don't have to include any of that Social Security income on your Vermont calculation. But if you're between 60 and 70, there's this phase out, and it'll help you calculate what percentage of your Social Security income you can exempt from taxation in Vermont. But the worksheet is pretty straightforward. Again, if you're using software and you're self-preparing, it'll walk you through this in the kind of the question and answer format that you're used to, or it'll just compute it for you, I think. So.
Mm-hmm. So another change that we have this year is we have a brand new Vermont W4.
That's right. So the W4 is the form you file with your employer if you're a wage earner to direct your employer how much state income tax to withhold. This one's really important, and I'm glad you brought it up, because this year with the radical, or I don't want to say radical, but the major changes at the federal and state level, a lot of people should be thinking about, or everyone should be thinking about, filing new W-4s with their employer. W-4 is a federal form, and then we have a W-4 VT, which is the Vermont version of that form. Earlier I talked about how we kind of departed a little bit from the federal calculation this year with this change, the federal and the state reform. Because of that, whereas in the past you might have just allowed your federal withholdings to dictate what your Vermont withholdings should be, for many tax filers, that's going to give you some weird results, either being under withheld or over withheld, particularly for those folks who have updated their federal W-4. W-4s are based on allowances, and you'll see that on the form that we have on the screen here, that it computes allowances having to do with your household makeup and how you file. The tax environment is now different, much more different between the feds and the state. So if you filed a corrected federal W-4, you really should file a corrected W-4 VT, and you can find that on our website. Even if you just Google W-4 VT Vermont taxes, it'll lead you to it. It's really straightforward. Should take 5 to 10 minutes or less, and you don't file that with us. You file that with your employer, and they will adjust your withholdings. Our goal here is to make sure people keep as much of their paycheck as they can without getting into issues of being under withheld or severely over withheld. We don't want people to have underpayment penalties or get refunds that are so big that they've been, underpaying themselves with their biweekly paycheck by sending too much to the state.
So one last thing that we probably should cover is the Department of Taxes is available to answer questions, and we've got some contact information that we'd like to share with people.
So yeah, this is the contact information. I'd say people seem to have much more success emailing in. And we do encourage that during tax season. We bring on a lot of temporary staff to handle the volume, but there are times when we're just so inundated with calls that you can have significant wait times. And we try to put those on the voicemail. When you call in, you'll hear the approximate wait time. But we really encourage folks to use the email address provided here, tax.individualincome@vermont.gov. And then the main phone number and the taxpayer services phone number are on here as well. It's important to note that the tax department phones are closed on Wednesdays, and the reason for that is to allow us to work on tax returns. We have the same staff that's we have a certain amount of individual income tax experts in the department, and those are the same folks that work and review tax returns so they can get refunds out faster, that also answer the phones and answer questions and let you know what the status of your filing is. So what we found is when the phone volume is so heavy during tax season that we have trouble getting into a rhythm of actually being able to review returns and release refunds and work through the backlogs and the work lists. So several years ago, the decision was made to close, turn off the phones on Wednesday and allow folks to just focus on processing these tax returns and reviewing them. And again, you can always email at any time, tax.individualincome@vermont.gov.
So just as a quick summary, do you want to just go over the key points, the key things that people need to remember to expedite their refund process in this upcoming season?
That's a great idea. So number one, don't file too early. Wait to see you have everything. Make sure you have everything. If you're unsure if you have everything, don't don't just file, maybe check last year or wait a little bit. Again, we're taping this in late January. A lot of forms come in before February 1st, and so at least waiting for January to run its course and make sure you've received all the 1099s and W-2s and different statements that you need. Number two, if you need help, get help. We gave you some resources for free software access, income qualified, free individual taxpayer access if you're or assistance if you are income qualified, and also encourage folks who are feeling overwhelmed to consult with a tax advisor. Like it or not, our tax system is really complicated at both the federal and state level, and people really should think about getting professional help if they're feeling overwhelmed. The e-filing, absolutely, the track record shows you're going to get your refund faster and there's going to be less errors. And then again, pay attention, another takeaway, pay attention to two big new changes this year, which is the charitable contribution tax credit, new in Vermont, available to anyone with a Vermont tax liability, and the Social Security exemption, which will give a partial or full exemption to Social Security recipients for their Social Security income. Again, half of Social Security recipients that had been paying tax in Vermont in the past on that income will benefit in some way from this new exemption. So those are the big takeaways, Deb.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We'd also like to thank Channel 13 for having us today.
17.
Yes.
Channel 17,
Channel 17. Sorry about
and
that,
Channel 17 Community Access. So it's great to have the opportunity to reach a broad network of Vermont taxpayers and give them half an hour of tax talk to help you be prepared for the upcoming filing season. And again, don't hesitate to reach out Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday on our phone lines, or email anytime if you need some assistance, and check the resources we've given you here for free taxpayer assistance and software. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.